steal from him. He owned 3 other stores and found out that 2 of his other managers were stealing from him. So I guess that's my roots in performance improvement all the way back then. In my Coast Guard career, I was fortunate enough to be exposed to leadership and a lot of leadership training, both receiving it and delivering it, and that was also a beginning of my roots in what we call performance improvement. Back then, I used to think that the role of a leader was to create an environment where his or her people could succeed. And I limited the environment really to that leadership environment of adjusting the amount of direction and support you give people based on their ability and willingness, the situational leadership model. But, you know, over the years, I learned that there were more things in the environment that could affect performance, and, you know, just eventually worked full-time for ISBI for 5 years and retooled at that point and really embraced performance technology. So that's kind of a thumbnail sketch of how I got to here.
I've heard that one of the things that you were involved with early was introducing the Coast Guard to human performance technology. Can you describe a little more about your role in that effort?
Yeah, this was back when I was in charge of a Coast Guard training center, the West Coast Training Center, located about 45 miles north of San Francisco, outside of a town called Petaluma. But the training center was responsible for training 4,000 students a year in 25 courses. I had about 115 instructors and staff. And when I got there, the curriculums, when you look at the design documents, they were all written with knowledge-based objectives as opposed to performance-based or behaviorally based objectives. And so, you know, I was concerned that, you know, we weren't teaching to the right standard, nor were we testing, nor were we evaluating in the field. So as part of that job, I instituted an evaluation system, which, you know, later on I learned was a level 3 evaluation. You got to remember that in, well, at least in my point of development in '83, I didn't have much of an instructional systems design background. I was a manager who wanted to evaluate the effectiveness of his programs. And evaluation included going out to the graduates and to their supervisors. And once we did that, what we found was fully a third of the training we were providing was either irrelevant or outdated. So we also asked an open-ended question with our direct questions. And the open-ended question was, what else did you need? And we found out that they needed quite a bit more work than what we were providing them. So, you know, our initial cut was rewriting the curriculum outlines in behavioral terms, then evaluating by surveying graduates and their supervisors as to how well they were able to perform those behaviors, and moving in that direction. At the same time, the Coast Guard was implementing a performance management system that I was part of the design team for, and that was really setting up both a goal setting and an observation and feedback process linked to a formal evaluation system. And that was another part of my contribution towards more of a performance-based Coast Guard. But we exported our ideas to the other training centers. The performance management system embraced the whole officer corps, so it got spread that way. And it was an interesting mix of things I was involved with that were laying the foundations for you know, more of a performance improvement effort once we knew what that term was.
And you've talked about performance improvement now with senior leadership in the Coast Guard, and you've talked about performance improvement with all sorts of managers and executives. What are some of the strategies you've used to be able to introduce this concept that's so foreign to many people?
Well, the main thing is to speak in the vocabulary of the people that you're working with. And to be quite frank, I would never say the words human performance technology in the presence of a manager. It is a term that is best used within ISPI. It is a highly descriptive phrase that I think is a wonderful shorthand for communicating with each other, but it is not the language of business. The language of business is performance improvement. So when I work with old clients as well as new clients, the term that we talk in terms of is the end, not so much the means. My job is to generally teach them the means, but again, I avoid the word performance technology, much to the dismay of maybe the academic community, but that's the realities of what I'm faced with. I just came back from the 2-day program I did for McDonald's at Hamburger U in Chicago, and without giving away anything that would be covered by my non-disclosure agreement, we worked on performance assessment and evaluation of their existing programs. This is the group that works with their the McDonald's that are outside of the United States. So this is their global enterprise. But working with them, I had managers in the class down to a team of instructional designers that were working on things and try to give them a different perspective. And the starting point for most organizations, to be quite frank, to get them into the performance improvement business is to just have them evaluate the training they're providing. My experience is that about less than 2% of organizations evaluate training at the level 4 and maybe 8% at the level 3. And if they would just evaluate their training, they would be drawn into the arena of performance improvement. So that's usually my starting point.
And one of the other things that you've spent a lot of time doing is looking at Gilbert's behavioral engineering model, revising that in ways that you've made your own case for, and then applying those models in situations where managers are reviewing performance. Could you give us an idea of how that came about, and then take us through your adaptation of the VEM, and then show us how you have used that to help managers assess the performance of their subordinates?
Yeah, I'd be delighted to. Where is the function on the screen here where I can put some slides up?
I've just made you a presenter, or I'm trying to make you a presenter.
I've got 2 different screens. One is, okay, something just changed. Let me just see what happened there.
And do you now have something that says show my screen? It says you are now the presenter, Roger.
Yeah, it looks like I have a slide up on the screen here, but I don't know. Are you seeing a slide for me that says work environment and individual?
Yes.
Oh, you are? Okay, great. I assume that everybody can see that. How this came about is kind of interesting. I was teaching in the instructional, the Performance Improvement Institute, which Roger Addison was shepherding, and I was teaching for him in different major companies, and we were using Gilberts Model, which I found to be rather archaic in terms of its the vocabulary that it used. It had terms like prosthesis in it. It had terms like instrumentation in it, and these would track people off into weird places, and I decided to update the model. A word to the wise, if you're going to update the model of a highly respected guru like Thomas Gilbert, I recommend that they be dead for at least 5 years. That's just a safety factor to make sure that you don't get any feedback. But when I published the article, all of a sudden I got an email from a Gilbert. It was Marilyn Gilbert, Tom's wife. And the thing that I found refreshing was she was very happy I had updated the model, but she said she was also delighted that I gave credit to Tom for his original work. You'll see this model presented by a lot of different people who never give credit to its original source, which was Tom Gilbert. And Tom's work, if you're looking at the slide, really broke down the work environment into three areas and also the characteristics of the individual into three areas. But the 85 and 15% you see off to the side there is really a breakdown that both Deming found to be true, Gary Rumler found to be true, Peter Dean found to be true. The work I'm doing with the nuclear community, where they take a look at this stuff, is found it basically to be true, although they find the numbers to be about 75%, 25%. But still, the lion's share of performance shortfalls fall into the upper area of the work environment. It's somewhere between 75 and 85% of performance issues are related to the work environment. And there we're talking about the information, resources, and incentives that are there in the work environment. And then we're also talking about the characteristics of the individual, but in reality that only makes up about 15% of the performance issues. So I went and updated the model, published it, and you should be able to see the updated behavioral engineering model now on your screen. Can somebody confirm that?
We see it.
Do you see it?
Yes, we do.
Okay, great. I'll assume that from this point on you can see all of them. The updated behavioral engineering model, I really tried to clarify the terms that Tom was using and also try to rearrange them into a more logical fashion. And by that I mean, if you look at the information cell, he would talk about feedback first and then expectation second. There's no way you can provide good feedback unless you've clarified the expectations in front. So when I defined this, I said roles and performance expectations are clearly defined, and the employees are then given relevant feedback and about their adequacy. I also talked about the guides that they would have. That's a form of information that they'd have, but also the performance management system that guides employee development. So that's the information cell. When you look at resources, you're looking at time, material, tools, processes and procedures being clearly defined, and a work environment that contributes to improved performance. If those two aren't right, you're not going to get much performance. Then you take a look at the incentives, and there we're really talking about how we measure things. There's a wonderful line by a man who was knighted as Lord Kelvin. His real name is William Thompson. But in 1883, he had the line, "You can't improve it if you can't measure it." And those words hold true to this day. When I heard Jack Welch speak in 2001, he said, "You get what you measure." And my phrase has always been, what gets measured gets done. And so measurement is a key aspect of this incentives box. But then also whether you have financial and non-financial incentives, where their jobs are enriched so that they can fulfill higher level needs, but also where the work environment is positive, where people think they have the opportunity to succeed. I studied under Hersey and Blanchard, the developers of situational leadership, for 6 years. And Blanchard's got a wonderful line in his book, The 1-Minute Manager: catch your people doing something right, as opposed to the typical management by exception that goes on where we catch our people doing something wrong. So those were the characteristics of the environment. I rewrote them, cranked them out. It's been interesting that in the nuclear community, one of my students, who's now really a colleague, took this and turned it into nuclear terms. And so this is a generic model, and he adapted it to the nuclear industry, and we're able to make some wonderful adaptations based on the ideas that he put forth. I took his models and my models to Vienna to work with the International Atomic Energy Agency a couple of years ago, and they are now publishing reports on performance improvement that include those models. We look at the individual. I always look at the motives before I get down to knowledge and skills. Motives, we're really talking about, are the employees' motives aligned with what the organization can provide? Do they desire to perform? And are they recruited and selected to match the realities of what's going on? When I look at capacity, we're really talking about both the capacity to learn as well as the capacity to do. And again, this is a recruitment issue. But also knowledge and skills. You know, do they have the knowledge and skills? And if you're focusing on instructional design, that's what you're focusing on with the needs assessment that you do. Do they have the knowledge and skills? And that's an important aspect of performance, but at the same time, it probably makes up 5 or 10% of the performance improvement equation, where the environment makes up 85%. So that's pretty much the model as I updated it, but it relies very, very heavily on what Tom Gilbert did for all of us years and years ago. Does anyone want to pose some questions on the model since you're studying it right now?
I think if you want to ask a question, you can either type it in the little chat bar on the bottom that Roger and I can see, or raise your hand.
Steve, at this point, I can't see that chat bar, so if some questions show up there, just if you'd read them to me and I'll respond.
I'm not seeing anyone raising a hand or posting a question. I do have one, and it seems to me that all too often when we encounter a gap between expected and desired performance, what we see is that people want to call it a training problem, and its roots are somewhere else, but the default response is training. Did that shape one of your thoughts in terms of the ordering of the cells in your updated behavioral engineering model?
Yeah, I believe that it goes information, resources, incentives, motives, capacity, and then knowledge and skills for a couple of different reasons. One, training is the drug of choice of American industry. And they're highly addicted to it. It's very expensive. You get decreasing returns the more you use. And so it's really an addiction problem that we have with training. And so I treat that one last. And I really try to exhaust the first cell information. There was a Gallup survey done, and the question was, improvement in which of one of these 12 areas would improve your performance the most? And far and away, the response that they receive on that, this is over millions of people, the response they typically get is, if I had clear expectations about the activities and results I should be getting, my performance would improve. So we don't go all the way down to knowledge and skills. We start with that information cell, then move to resources and incentives. When we deal with the individual, I think motives are a key factor. A lot of people know what to do, but they're not motivated to do what it is they're supposed to be doing. Same thing is true with capacity. And the other thing is that if you can select properly for the individual, meaning select for the basic knowledge and skills, their capacity to do and learn, and their motives, you're not going to have to do much training. A good example of this was a trainer, an outside trainer, was going through a Nordstrom's department store with a Nordstrom's trainer, and they came up with this question about halfway through their tour, and it was, tell me, how do you train your people to be so polite? And the response from the Nordstrom trainer was, we don't. We hire people whose parents taught them to be polite. Well, most of the factors down at the bottom should be selection factors. And then where we do need to train in knowledge and skills, it should be highly focused. But you're right, Steve, in that typically organizations want to start with knowledge and skills and don't realize that the environment is actually more important than the knowledge and skills that they impart in the training. When I was a vice president of Century 21, I thought that probably 50% of the sales training we were doing wouldn't be necessary at all if managers were doing their job in creating the proper environment. So from my own experience, I found that you really want to work at the top first. then take a look at the motives and capacity, and the last thing, if you're looking at a performance issue, is typically the knowledge and skills.
Roger, Jim Lupton raised her hand to ask a question, and I'm giving her microphone capabilities to ask it.
Wonderful.
Hi. I'm wondering, does the Coast Guard leadership training include anything related to the BAM?
That's a good question. I've kind of lost track of what they do in their leadership training. So, you know, it's I'd have to find that out for you. I'm not sure whether they use the updated behavioral engineering model. The head of their Human Performance Center, I saw he actually gave a presentation to the Armed Forces chapter where he had 8 buttons to push. And they were these 6 and then 2 others, which one of them I remember was the way in which they assign people within the Coast Guard. And off the top of my head, I can't remember what the other one is. So I know they're using the behavioral engineering model, and he even referenced my article in his presentation, but whether or not they're training in the leadership program to this, I really don't know. Good question, though.
Do you think it's, sorry, do you think it's valuable to, do you think it's valuable to give that kind of training early on? If they're not doing it, do you think it would be useful for them to do that?
Yeah, I honestly believe that we've missed the mark in ISPI by not making our tools available to line managers and supervisors. If any of you are familiar with my book, it was published by the American Management Association, and it's written specifically for managers and supervisors. And it introduces this model and the force field analysis worksheet. And but the first 5 chapters are on leadership. There's a case study. Then the next 5 chapters are on how to improve performance and follow our standards in that they first have to do a gap analysis. Then they do a cause analysis using this. Then they select their interventions. Then they make the intervention. Then they evaluate the results. So it's a modified version of the last 6 standards of human performance technology. But I honestly believe that the biggest bang for the buck is taking this information, bringing it down to the manager's level, bringing it to the supervisor's level, where they can use it and deal with tactical problems, freeing up the internal consultant or an external consultant to work on more strategic and larger problems. So yes, I am a strong believer that this belongs in training provided to line managers and supervisors. The best example where this is taking place is with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, in that they train everyone from the inspector, who would be the head of a division, right down to the Mountie on the beat, and both leadership and performance technology techniques, including this model, and they have shown business results. They're in the business of crime, such as reduced crime rates, increased effectiveness of their ability to write warrants and serve warrants, and a whole host of other safety and legal issues that are their desired business outcomes. So I really believe that this can be taught at that level, and the real bang for the buck of what we do isn't at the consultant level, but at the line manager level.
That's interesting that they've been able to reduce crime using this. Thank you very much.
Another great example of this is the work of USAID, and I've done work with them in Europe. But the applications that they've made of Gilberts Model, if you will, and other techniques in reducing AIDS epidemics in certain countries where they realized it wasn't a training issue, it was a performance issue, in reducing birth rates in some countries where overpopulation was really eroding the society. They use it in different ways, and while we think of this as a tool that can be used at the individual level, the worker level, and the organizational level, it can also be worked at the society level. But one thing I'll say about the updated behavior engineering model, like Gilbert's model, it works best at the individual level and the work level. It does not work well for an organizational scan. If you're doing an organizational scan, I look at something like Don Tosti's model, which instead of having 6 boxes has got 16. It's a very complex model, difficult for a novice to use, unlike this one, which I think you could teach a supervisor to use. But the bottom line is that it is a much more powerful and rigorous model for doing an organizational scan. This works better at the individual worker level and the work process level, and that's why I chose it for training managers and supervisors.
Roger, Rick wants to know if you can explain the connection between incentives and measurement.
Okay. Just the act of measurement can improve performance. If you do a level 3 or a level 4 evaluation of your graduates, the fact that they know they're being observed and being measured will actually improve performance. This is the Hawthorne effect. A group that thinks it's being observed tends to outperform a group that doesn't think it's being observed. So just the act of measurement alone can shape performance. But then when you add in incentives, now you're incentivizing the act that you want. So measurement starts this process, and you have to measure the right things, and then you incentivize those right things to actually improve performance. But you can't do incentives without proper measurement, so the two are highly interrelated. Great question.
And how do you reconcile the difference between training and learning? In this model, learning is restricted to knowledge and skill. Might learning also encompass information and other components?
I wrote an article for Chief Learning Officer magazine when they were first starting, and I said that Chief Learning Officers have to redefine learning. Learning is not just what happens in a classroom. Learning is not just acquiring knowledge. Learning is everything and anything that contributes to a change in behavior. And so you're absolutely right that the supervisor really has the key role in the information cell, where the trainer has the key role in the knowledge and skills. That's not to say that learning doesn't happen on the job. Indeed, more than half the learning that happens with an individual happens on the job. It's probably closer to 75% of what is learned about a job is learned on the job, so it really happens in the information cell. But the traditional location of learning is with the individual in the classroom when they impart the basic knowledge and skills. But if it's not happening on the job, it's probably not happening at all, either because it should be done on the job or the environment should support the training that's happening in the classroom. So those two interact, just like incentives and motives interact.
And Jen has asked, how long does a cycle take from needs assessment to validation, measurement of strategy implementation?
Well, the case study that's in the article that went along with this, it's referenced here, the May-June 2003 Performance Improvement article, that case study was of a small software company, and from the time I received the initial call, I had the interview with the manager, then interviewed his people, the design and development of the intervention, training was part of the intervention, 2 systems were installed that would be self-correcting systems. From the beginning of that process to that point where the systems were installed was 2 weeks. Most people think this takes a long period of time to go through this process. The 2 systems were both measurement systems that were put in place to both measure the effectiveness of the salespeople that were in the case, but also to provide feedback to them so they could continue their development. So it was not measurement just for the sake of measuring. It was a feedback loop directly back to those people. So, you know, in some interventions on a much larger scale, this could take 2 months to 6 months, the whole process of bringing them through. Sometimes the evaluation will take quite a bit longer. In the Coast Guard, the evaluation program we put in place, you know, over a 5-year period, we were able to show after the second and third year we were getting returns on our investment, but we actually saved, out of $9 million being spent on student salaries and instructor salaries, we had saved $3 million, reducing it down to $6 million by improving the quality of training while reducing the length of time that it took to do. So that was a 5-year period of evaluation and continuous improvement. So you can get some short-term results, and then there are the longer-term results, which you have to take over time. So, you know, it just depends on what you're looking at and the scale at which you're working.
Chris asks, how often do you suggest that interventions are measured or remeasured after implementation?
Well, it depends. Let's just talk about evaluation of the training program. In the Coast Guard, when we were implementing a new course, we would baseline the old course, implement the new course, and for 3 or 4 classes in a row, we would survey every graduate and their supervisor to determine the impact of that training. But once the course was stabilized, which might be over a 2 to 3 year period where we were content that we were hitting probably 90% of what we should be, we would evaluate it maybe once every 6 months or sometimes once a year. But evaluation shouldn't be that we're going to evaluate all of our courses. Evaluation should be done with kind of a triage in terms of picking out your high-value courses. I worked with a company where they trained 15 to 20,000 people a year in the same course. That was a high-value course simply because of the numbers of people that it reaches. But I worked with another company in the nuclear business where it was training 5 or 6 people a year, so it didn't seem high value from that point of view. But the job they were training them in was how to take the rods out of the nuclear reactor without damaging either the rods or the nuclear reactor, and then how to refuel the nuclear reactor. Well, you don't want a mistake to be made there. That was another high-value course to be evaluated. So you should look at the value of the course to determine both should it even be evaluated and then how frequently should it be evaluated, but also the newness of the course versus a stabilized course. If it's new, you want to evaluate it on a regular basis. If it's stabilized, maybe once every 6 months, once a year. If it's high value, you may want to continue to evaluate it over time, or once it stabilizes again, you may want to spread it out a little bit more. So it really depends on where you are in the development cycle of a course and the value of the course. Those are the 2 variables I would look at. Great question.
Roger, we are running out of time that we've allocated for the webinar capability. And so it could be that we're all going to turn into pumpkins in about 20 seconds. If that's the case, what I'd like to do is to thank you for spending time with us today and sharing your expertise with us. Might we be able to collect some additional questions from our students and forward them to you?
That would be great. I'm leaving for Ireland to present at the ISBI Europe conference on Monday. Then my wife is joining me. We're going to spend a couple of weeks over there, but I can be reached by email. That's the best way to get those questions to me. And I'd be happy to respond, but if I don't get back to you in 2 weeks, don't be surprised. I hear they have a lot of Guinness over there that may distract me a little bit.
We understand the turnaround issue. The good news is that we didn't all turn into pumpkins when the planned duration of our meeting was exceeded, so we have time for a few additional questions.
Steve?
Yes?
Before you do that, what you've got in front of you is what I would call a model. It's a way of organizing material. It's a way of filtering information. It's a way of making sure that you've got the information. But in that article, I launched the tool that goes with it, And now there's an upgraded version of this in the articles that I sent to you to distribute to the students. But the next level up is a form, that the top part of the form is really this determining of the gap, the present level, the desired level, and then setting a reasonable goal. I'm the only one that talks about this reasonable goal, but it's very important that if you have a 5-year performance gap, this is where we are now, this is where we want to be in 5 years, that you set a reasonable goal, say for a year or for 6 months, that acts as a milestone. But then we use force field analysis, and this is the way it's laid out. There's a case study in that article that allows you to, first of all, can you see my arrow moving? No, I can't even see it moving, so forget that. But each of those cells that we talked about, there are 4 of these factors here that we can take a look at under information, clear expectations, feedback guides, and performance management systems. Then we evaluate, are they working for us or against us in closing the performance gap? If they're working for us, they're a driving force. If they're real strong, they're a 3 or a 4. If they're weak, they're a 1 or a 2. If they're working against us in closing the performance gap, they're a restraining force. Real strong, they're a -3 or -4. Weak, -1 or a -2. Once we get this picture out there, we have a snapshot in time of the performance gap, the reasonable goal. We've identified and weighted and displayed the driving and restraining forces. We're at the point where we can start to select the interventions we want to make. I just wanted to show your students the tool that goes along with the model. So now I'll take any other questions.
Chris had asked, are organizations typically remeasuring after they do an initial measurement? I've
found that, most organizations, well, first of all, there are very few organizations that are evaluating their interventions. When you look at training, that's the best example with, like I said, maybe 8% doing level 3 and 2% doing level 4 would be my best guess. So the odds on them doing remeasuring are probably a 1/4 of that, so you're getting down in the decimal points for level 4. Most people think of evaluation as a one-time, one-shot intervention as opposed to an opportunity to identify anomalies and then go back and identify the causes. If you want a good article on evaluation that I wrote, if you go to my website at www.aboutiwp.com, there's 4 articles down there you can download. There's nothing you got to fill out. You just go to the articles and resources section. But in the article on evaluation, there are 3 case studies that talk about evaluation I think might be of value to you. So take a look at that.
Roger, we seem to have, could you repeat the URL one more time, please? www.about.
Yeah, about IWP. So it's all one word, aboutiwp.com. And if you go there, that's my website, but just click on articles and resources, and there's 4 downloadable PDFs that are there for the taking. They are the drafts of the articles that I published in Performance Improvement. I've also sent 2 of my latest articles on that I hope get distributed to you. One is tracing out the history of the worksheet that's in front of you and gives the advanced version of that worksheet. And the second article is a case study related to it. So I got such a good response on the article, I decided to write a second one that had the case study. So those might be of value in that it's a this force field analysis that's here I think is very good for managers and supervisors to use, but the consultant version is in the new articles, so take a look at those. They're not on the website yet.
We have a question from Jolene Mitchell asking, what types of techniques or strategies do you use to determine issues associated with motives?
Well, you know, motives and incentives are interrelated, and very often we'll start by looking at the incentive systems that they have, the measurement and incentive systems, and then we see if they're having the desired response, you know, from the individuals, and the response is generated by their motives and whether or not they're aligned with the incentives that are there. So I kind of start backwards. I look at the incentive systems and are they working? If they're not working, then you've got to look at the motives of the individuals that are there. So we, again, start with incentives and work towards motives. Some of the best things you can do is ask your people, you know, what type of rewards they'd be interested in, and then have an incentive system that's based on what they perceive as the reward. Rewards are always in the perception of the person who's receiving them. It's not what we think we're giving them, but it's what they perceive.
And I think that's a good distinction. The other thing I've heard is motives are things that get you out of bed in the morning.
Yeah, I guess that's true. My dog is what gets me out of bed in the morning. I'll have to rename Bender as motives.
Roger, thank you again for the generous amount of time you've spent with us, your patience with our technical issues. I'd like to thank all of our faculty and our students who've attended in this event and encourage you to come back again next week when we'll be visited by Dr. Al Folsom, and he'll be talking with us more about front-end analysis. Roger?
When you talk to Al, ask him if the behavioral engineering model is in their leadership programs. He left only a year ago as the Director of Performance and Learning for the Coast Guard, so he would be up to date on that question.
We'll do that. Roger, thanks again, and safe travels.
Oh, thank you. My best to everybody and your continued studies. Bye now.